Good afternoon and welcome.
Right in here.
Glad you're here. So I'm Rich Veenstra. I'm a Upstate Medical University employee. I'm a professor in the pharmacology department. And since 2019, I've been the United University Professions Chapter President to 4,500 employees at Upstate Medical University, including a majority of those 4,500 being healthcare workers in the hospital. So I want to thank the mayor for the opportunity to allow us to speak to you here today. I also want to give a shout out to some of our colleagues, Mark Spatafor, the Greater Syracuse Labor Council President, and it also happens to be his birthday. So, and Sam Roberts is a candidate for the 22nd Congressional District and a former Assembly member. So welcome. So you're going to hear from community and union leaders about why it's important to support the SUNY Upstate Medical University and Hospital. So Upstate Medical University employs about 11,000 people and generates $2.5 billion for the local and state economy. Yet 98% of Upstate's operating revenue is self-generated. Only 2% of it comes from the state. And none of that 2% goes to the hospital. The hospital receives no money from the state. So Upstate cares for more than 500,000 patients per year from every county in the state, every state in the nation, and also internationally. Upstate serves a population of more than 2 million people and is the safety net hospital for our region. Our university hospital is also the second busiest level 1 trauma center in the state, and it's also the only children's hospital, comprehensive cancer center, burn center, and poison control center for all of central New York and beyond. It's also the only academic medical center in central New York, and 90% of the students in all 4 colleges, medicine, nursing, health professions, and graduate studies, hail from New York State, and most of them remain in-state upon graduation. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Upstate developed the most sensitive COVID saliva test in the U.S. It's been utilized by SUNY K-12 public schools, Syracuse University, and also the Carrier Dome. To date, nearly 3 million saliva samples have been processed. Upstate was also chosen to assist in the sequencing and identification of SARS-CoV-2 variants, including Delta and Omicron, and it's a site for Pfizer vaccine clinical trials from infant children to elder adults, and it's also a regional hub for the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Early on, Upstate also provided clinical leadership for the New York City's Javits Center and provided more than 50 nurses, respiratory therapists, and other clinical staff to assist Stony Brook University during the original spring of 2020 COVID-19 pandemic surge. Now there are critical staffing shortages everywhere. Prior to COVID, there were some staffing shortages in our hospital here in Syracuse, about 10 to 20%. But during the most recent COVID-19 surge, the night shift respiratory therapists were down by 50%, just enough to cover the intensive care units that were full of COVID-19 patients on ventilators. And they had to monitor double the number of ventilators just to provide that coverage. These are the people who intubate the patients who require a ventilator to breathe. When the COVID-19 pandemic began, the concerns were how to protect the workforce and treat the COVID-19 patients. PPE was in short supply. Healthcare workers isolated from their families to keep them safe by living out of hotel rooms. And this was only the beginning of their personal burdens. As the pandemic wore on, our hospital healthcare workers left for higher paying jobs in the private sector, as travelers were just burned out from the years-long burdens and left. They faced longer hours, mandations, and shifting schedules. Their home lives were perpetually disrupted, and childcare was scarce for their ever-changing hours. Now, due mostly to staffing shortages, beds are closed, operating rooms remain closed, revenue is down, expenses are up, and the hospital is losing millions of dollars per week. So what is this about? Well, it is about the state keeping the promise that it made over 20 years ago to support the SUNY hospitals in exchange for not paying the benefits of those hospital workers. It is about a young mother who gets mandated to work another 4 hours before she can go home and care for her infant child. It is about a young mother who can't find childcare for the off hours after 5 p.m. when she's notified that she's going to have to start working the evening shift next month. It's about the young parents who work second jobs after those long hours in the hospital to support their growing families. There are many stories that we could tell. The effects of the pandemic on our communities will not end until the burdens on our healthcare system and our healthcare workers are lifted. We must fund our SUNY hospitals who have served heroically throughout this pandemic to provide the healthcare necessary for their communities. We must fund our SUNY hospitals to provide the staffing and salaries necessary to alleviate the burdens on our current remaining workforce. The need is now, the time is now, the opportunity is now. We must fund our SUNY hospitals now. So next, it's my pleasure to introduce a colleague of mine from Upstate Medical University, Stephen Glatt, who is the chair of our faculty governance.
Thanks, Rich, for so eloquently making the case for funding SUNY hospitals. I'm Stephen Vlad. I'm a professor of psychiatry, of neuroscience, and of public health at SUNY Upstate Medical University. I'm an upstate New York native. I graduated from Syracuse University, and I've been back at Upstate for 15 years doing research on the causes of addiction and mental illness. I also have the pleasure of serving as the chair of the Faculty Council, and in that capacity, we instituted a program during COVID to give commendations to our faculty and staff who are giving so much of themselves to fight the pandemic. We received over 600 nominations and issued those commendations to our great staff and faculty who work so hard. The past 2 years have illustrated the compassion and self-sacrifice of our staff who have cared for patients and their families under the most trying circumstances of their lives. While at the same time, Upstate has supported the state and SUNY in its response to the pandemic through our patient care, testing, and research, as Rich has pointed out. We urge our elected leaders at all levels to take action to ensure the 3 SUNY academic medical centers have the resources needed to fulfill their missions of life-saving clinical care, medical education, and scientific research. I want to thank UUP, PEF, and CSCA for your continued support of our mission. And next up, I'd like to introduce Helen Hudson, the president of the Syracuse Common Council. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and again, I want to echo the same thing as Mr. Glatt. Thank you, UUP, thank you, PEF and CSCA. I'm not going to reiterate some of the things that were said because they're all true. But I do know I'm going to come from a different angle. Upstate University Hospital is the premier trauma center, not just in Syracuse, region-wide. And I've had an opportunity to actually see them in work. I am co-founder of Mothers Against Gun Violence, and over the past 20 years, I've had to respond to Upstate for over 400 shootings. And when you see how proficient they are in taking care of all of these traumatic incidents, I am going to urge our state assembly to think about putting sufficient funding into Upstate. Not just for traumatic, we're talking about psychiatric. I have a whole bunch of stories. My son had been working with Dr. Stephen Johnson, which I think is a phenomenal program. It's psychiatry and drug addiction. That's so needed in this community because if you just walk down the street, it's evident, you can see it, it's right in your face. And then when you talk about Galasanos Children's Hospital, I had a niece. She needed a bone marrow, and they were right on top of her. She didn't make it, but they did everything they could to ensure that she had all the services and the care that she needs. So again, I'm going to join with the crowd here, and I'm going to implore our state representatives to sufficiently fund Upstate University Medical Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And again, welcome to everybody. I'm usually the hostess of the community, so I'm here. I'm here as the president of the Central New York Area Labor Federation, which represents over 100,000 workers and their families throughout our 11 counties of Central New York. And I'm here to simply give a very clear message that we are standing with all of our brothers and sisters who work at SUNY Hospital. We are standing with UUP. And it sounds simple, but you know who we stand for too? I don't only stand for union brothers and sisters. I stand for all of us in this community. I stand for all of us in those 11 counties, because what we fight for as a union, what you heard so eloquently laid out today, a story about what really goes on in our healthcare system. And remember, whether you're poor or rich or black or white or purple or whatever your religion is, they have to take you at that hospital. And I heard stories during the pandemic about people who had to stay, or their shifts got moved around and they were on a different floor to take care of COVID patients. And I was like, to be honest, I always say, oh, why is that important? Because I don't understand that industry, even though, by the way, I do represent the cafeteria workers at Upstate. And the cafeteria workers, they feed not only the patients, but they feed the staff. And they too worked during the pandemic. But I asked one of the nurses, I asked Rich, why is it so important that you can't work on a different, what is the big deal about not working on a different floor when you go in? And in this case, wasn't Rich, but the nurse told me, she says because, and she started telling me what it takes, what skills it takes to take care of that COVID patient with a ventilator. How you have to turn them every so many minutes, and you have to have staff. And when you get shifted around, it's not a matter of you don't want to go on that floor. It's a matter of you want to have your best skills. And this brings us back to SUNY again. Where do you think the teaching goes on? Where do you think we get new doctors from, and new nurses from, and new staff, and my scientists, I call them? Because these are the people I asked right at the beginning of the COVID epidemic. Should I wear those gloves? Should I wear a mask? And that's where we got our information from, the research that they do. These people represent those who take care of all of us, regardless of your illness, regardless of who you are. They're mandated to do that. And yet what the public doesn't know is what you just heard, they're not fully funded. New York State, the greatest state in the country, right? I was born and bred. And yet we can't fully fund our Upstate University Hospital. And you know what fully funding means? It not only means more staff to take care of more people in our community, which we need, it also means upgrade the facility. New technical. We all know, right? Aren't we excited? We go to the dentist and it doesn't hurt because he's got new technology. Well, the same thing up there. I mean, really, right? I'd much rather go if I know they have the latest in technology and the latest in medication and research to know how I'm going to get well. And that's what happens up at our hospital here. And yet we can't fully fund the building. And we certainly don't fully fund the workers. They abandoned, as you heard, they abandoned their families just so they could take care of all of us. They were mandated to do so. They couldn't say, I have to leave. They not only were mandated by their employer, but they had a personal obligation. And yet they never received hazard pay. Why not? They had to fight. If I remember correctly, you had to even fight for raises that you were supposed to get. I mean, last year was not easy for healthcare workers in Central New York. The last 2 years, excuse me. I remember them saying, no, we didn't get our June raise that was already negotiated. They had to fight for everything. So today we are we are demanding that Governor Hochul pass on to her legislature and every legislator who's listening to vote yes to fully fund not only SUNY Upstate Hospital, but the whole healthcare system within New York State.
Right.
So that we have equal medical protection, whether we live in Montauk, which by the way is the end of Long Island, or we live in Buffalo, or we live in Niagara Falls. We in Central New York certainly deserve what the rest of the state has, and we want fully funding now. No more excuses. This is it. If COVID hasn't proved that, then nobody deserves to be in office. Tell you the truth.
Yes,
Thank
that's
you.
right.
And I'm going to introduce the man who's leading this, Fred Kohl.
Thanks very much, Anne-Marie. I'm Fred Kohl, president of United University Professions, and it is my distinct privilege to lead the largest higher education union in the United States. Roughly 42,000 members when we include our very active and engaged retirees. Dave Ritchie from Cortland stands behind me. If I don't say that, he will swing that sign at me. We are joined today by our statewide officer corps, all but one, who's also celebrating a birthday today. It's a popular thing to be doing these days. We have with us from Stony Brook Hospital, in fact, Carolyn Kuby, who is our vice president for professionals. And to show how UUP and SUNY is all across New York State, our vice president for academics, Alyssa Carl from Brockport. And our membership development officer from the University at Albany, Tom Hoey. Former vice president for academics from Cortland, Jamie Dangler for secondary. I forgot. How could I forget? And our staff, and it is really a great gathering here. And I think what you've been hearing is how emotional this can get for all of us engaged in the work of healing and in the work of teaching that we do in what I believe to be the greatest union in this country. I want to start with a quote from Nelson Mandela. Those folks from UUP know that I quote from Madiba often. He once wrote that our society needs to reestablish a culture of caring. And I think that is important for today's world. Caring is the hallmark of the people who give their lives for the sick, to healing them, to finding ways to keep us from getting sick, and to find the ways to answer the literally life and death questions about disease and all that afflict all of us at some point in our lives. Our members at Upstate join with the other members who work at Downstate in Brooklyn and Stony Brook. That's 13,000 of our members are committed to the principle that their work is about teaching, research, and healing, all of that. And that is the best that public higher education can do. And we all know, as you've heard other speakers before me, we know of the economic impact of this incredible facility, the largest, most dynamic employer in Onondaga County. And given the fact that upstate New York has been economically depressed for so long, that crucial role becomes even more important. Because let's face facts, I'm an upstater myself. I live in Schoharie County, one of the poorest counties in New York State. We have been abandoned. Neglect has been the hallmark, if you want to call it that, of the state policy towards the economic situation in upstate New York. Neglect born of partisanship, corruption, and yes, racism. And our call today is to end this economic, social, and racial injustice. Hear, hear. New York State has the resources.
Yes. That's right.
All it takes is courage, will, and wisdom. Courage, like that we have witnessed and that you've heard about, shown by our colleagues throughout the COVID pandemic as they protected all of us from this killer disease. The kind of will that this union, I am proud to say, exhibited when we went out and purchased the personal protective equipment that our members and others at Upstate needed because the state of New York didn't do it. That's what unions can do, and that's what we did. And then, of course, there is wisdom. Wisdom that we all must embrace. Understanding that it is only by finding that culture of caring will we survive these days of a global pandemic, a climate crisis, and presently, ongoing war on freedom. What we ask for, and I gotta say, Anne-Marie, you hit the nail on the head. We're not asking, we're demanding. All we are demanding is what any just society will provide, resources needed for the public by those entrusted to act on behalf of the public, the governor of the state of New York and our state legislators. As I said, for too long, upstate has been neglected, and that must end now. You know, just in terms of SUNY and the 29 campuses UUP represents, and then you include the 30 or so community colleges stretched all across New York State. If the budget for SUNY had just been kept where it was in 2007 when the Great Recession hit, SUNY would have $7 billion more. Can you imagine what could happen at that hospital if those resources were available, along with all the other campuses and indeed the economy of New York State? Some have called for a new deal for CUNY, a new deal for SUNY. What I call for is a fair deal for all of New York. Not just for New York City, not just for the few, and not just for the Buffalo Bills billionaire owner. If the state of New York can find $1 billion for a new playground for millionaire football players, I think they can find a few $100 million for state public hospitals and a state university.
That's right.
We demand these resources to build up the saving place, that's what I call it, the saving place of upstate, to raise up the communities of our state along the Mohawk River, on the shores of the Great Lakes, and in the magnificent mountain valleys where we all live. Our demands are simple, and the answer we seek is very simple. Simpler still. Yes. Yes to our cities and towns, to our colleges, our hospitals, to our shared labor. Now is the time. The future, indeed the present, and the call of justice demands it. We must do this now. We are looking for the answers that we are demanding from this governor and this legislature. They have the resources, they have the opportunity. All they need is the courage and the will. Thank you. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the Reverend Beth DuBois, pastor of South Valley Presbyterian Church.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. I really appreciate it. And thank you again for all the wonderful work you've done all across the state. If we haven't said it enough, we really deeply thank you for the time away from your family and the time making do with less than adequate resources. My name is Beth DuBois. I am the former pastor actually at South Valley Presbyterian Church. We closed in the summer. We made do as much as we could with the resources we had. And sometimes you can't make them stretch anymore. I do not want to be the person that tells my 6-year-old grandson that we couldn't figure out in New York State how to stretch our resources, which we really aren't stretching, right? We have them.
That's right.
How to have the resources to fund public hospitals and public education. That is insane.
That's right.
That is completely wrong. You might ask what a pastor has to say about higher education or hospitals. You might be surprised, maybe. I go into every hospital here on a regular basis. I see the results of the kind of care and dedication the hospital staff and personnel offer, not only in the hospital, but in the community. The job I'm working at now at University United Methodist Church has the largest food distribution program in the city right now. And medical students from the Elizabeth Blackwell Leadership Group come and work with us and offer screenings and support to the over 100 clients who are often homeless or low income that come on Sundays, and to the between 250 to 350 families that come on Fridays for food to last them all week. I want them not to have a job anymore. And I think in New York State, we can do that. And if we didn't think we could do that or that it was needed, COVID certainly told us it was.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It did, because not only do we need to develop the best minds and the best intellectual rigor among our students and leaders for the future, but we need to invest in the spaces they learn and work in so that they're safe and up to date. Invest in the technical resources they need in order to make the discoveries and come up with solutions to problems we can't even anticipate. Because frankly, folks, I believe COVID might not be done with us, and there's probably something else around the corner.
Yep.
And if we know nothing else, we're all interconnected. So it's not just the folks that come to the food line, it's every one of us. Every one of us is impacted by this. We need to invest in students, in teachers, in those resources, in our doctors and hospitals, so that the students and the people around them in the community are healthy enough to think, to engage critically in the difficult decisions that we have to make. It shouldn't be that hard. We have the money. We have the resources. We need the will.
That's right.
And the courage. The will and the courage to make hard decisions that invest in people. People are our most valuable resources. Doesn't matter their class, doesn't matter their income or the color of their skin, none of that matters. Every child that goes through the food line is a potential Beethoven, is a potential Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell or Dr. Sarah Logan. Every child, they deserve access to an education, and frankly, we need them to have it. Because I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting old. Who's gonna take care of me? And who's gonna figure out all these problems that I didn't manage to figure out? Because I'm not happy about what I'm leaving to my children and grandchildren. But what I do want to leave to them are the resources, the teachers, the opportunities to come together and to solve those problems. Our institutions, our hospitals, and our colleges are the pillars of our community. They hold us up. They hold us up. We can't let them crack. We can't. We need to support them. We need them to have the resources, to have the student support services, the class offerings, whatever they need to make sure that our children and generations to come get not only good public health care, but the opportunity to learn and to work together. Because without them, the future is not very secure. So let's pause for just a sec. Preacher's privilege, right? That's what happens when you have a preacher at the end, right? Pause for just a moment, though. And let's pause and give thanks in whatever tradition is close to your heart for what we have received from our brothers and sisters who have already given so generously. And let's pause and give thanks for them and pray for the courage and the will together to fully fund what they need to continue. Let us pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks very much. Mayor Ben Walsh he's double scheduled. That happens a lot in his position. And so, unfortunately, he has not been able to join us, but nonetheless, we want to thank everyone for coming today, for expressing what I believe we all feel, which is if there has ever been a time to address the long-term underfunding of public higher education, and specifically the public teaching hospitals, and specifically the one here in Syracuse at Upstate, now is the time. We, with the media here, we are open to any questions that you might have to any of those who have spoken. So yeah, with that, I'll just open it up to the media for questions.
Do you have a specific dollar amount in mind that you would hope for Upstate in particular?
Yes.
Certainly.
Yeah, I think what Rich would say about Upstate is about $250 million to start. But you know, and I'm not being facetious. I think that the long-term needs are huge. When the deal was cut in the early aughts, whereby the state committed itself to providing a subsidy every year to the 3 SUNY public teaching hospitals, that was done in exchange for the hospitals picking up the cost of the fringe benefits and the debt servicing on any of the capital work being done through state dollars. Now, what has happened, starting with Andrew Cuomo's first year, he first proposed to eliminate the entire subsidy. And over the years, it gradually got chipped away from a high of $150 million roughly for all 3 hospitals, till 2 years ago, it was totally eliminated. And as Rich pointed out, there literally is no public money coming into the public hospital. It makes no sense. And yet the cost, the combined cost in this fiscal year for debt servicing and for the fringe benefits is $230 million at Upstate alone. And so what we are saying, look, the solution is very basic and very reasonable. We want to see the state of New York take up the cost of the debt servicing so that improvements can be done. Whenever there's capital funding in the budget, it can be used. If there is funding provided to cover the debt servicing. And then second, bring back the subsidy. The New York State Assembly in its one house budget put $147 million in. That would be a good start. So basically what we are saying is a debt servicing covered and a subsidy, whatever we can get, but that, you know, the closer we can get to what I feel to be a down payment on what we've lost would be upwards of $200 million for the 3 hospitals combined. I think that would be a good start.
What about staffing? I know the governor mentioned doing things to help hospitals with staffing issues in her State of the State address. What would you hope from the state and the state budget helping Upstate with that?
Yeah, and I welcome my colleagues from Upstate to join in on this one. What I will say is, from the big picture, the way I see it is that by underfunding the SUNY hospitals, the SUNY teaching hospitals, for the entire time that Andrew Cuomo was governor, when you did that, you set the stage for the shortage of nurses, of nurse practitioners, of respiratory therapists, of physicians, all the professions necessary to keep our society healthy. It was not COVID that created a shortage in human resources in the healthcare professionals. That storm was brewing for 11 years of underfunding because these 3 academic medical centers, you add the medical school at Buffalo University of Buffalo, that's over half of the incoming professionals into the healthcare professions in New York State every year. If you don't fund the hospitals, the medical schools cannot bring in as many students, you don't get the success rates, and you don't get people entering the professions. There's always been a lot of focus on nursing. Great. One of the biggest impediments is that in order to expand nursing programs, you need to be able to hire faculty, desperately needed. Right now, there are shortages of faculty in nursing programs that need to be addressed. And so it is, there are multiple factors here, but it's going to take heavy investment. It simply is not going to happen with some sort of silver bullet in 1 year. Rich, if you wanted to add anything on that, come on over.
Sure. Thanks, Fred. So specific to Upstate, Fred just mentioned faculty. Upstate Medical University has 50% of the average number of faculty per students of any medical school in the country. So we're half the faculty that most medical schools have in this nation. Just today, this morning, I got an email from someone in pharmacy. They are down 8 positions in the pharmacists. So it's every department within the hospital. It's, yes, we're down maybe 600 nurses now. It was 400. I think it's probably 600 now, which is a primary reason why we have hundreds of beds closed and we can't open up all the ORs. But it's everything. It is the technicians. It's the clinical labs. When the doctor orders a diagnostic test, that goes to the clinical labs. They have been understaffed from the beginning. I was meeting with them about having to work more and more time, and went from one weekend a month to now every other weekend. The staffing shortage is everywhere. It's nurses, it's pharmacists, it's respiratory therapists, it's med techs, it's everybody. It's therapists, it's technicians, it's rampant. And it's like the food insecurity. Really, the issue was there. COVID-19 just amplified it.
Yeah.
We have staffing insecurity in our hospitals, all of them.
Thanks, Richard. Any other questions? Well, thanks again, and thanks to all of our speakers who have joined us today for offering your wisdom and your insight and inspiration. Thanks very much.